In two previous videos, I've talked about the power of the Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom's introduction areas, and why they're so impactful on the experience of those games. But today, I want to take a look at the best video game introduction I've ever experienced, The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time. The start of a game is just as important, if not more important than the rest. This is true for any type of entertainment. The start is a hook that pulls you into the core of the experience. But if that hook can't grab you, the game fails to express the fun that can be had later on. Similar to a book with a terrible first chapter, but an amazing 300 pages following it. If that first chapter fails to hook you, you might quit reading and never experience those pages. And if the first hour of a game isn't compelling or fun enough, you may miss out on endless hours of fun later. Ocarina of Time is special for several reasons. The first of which is how its introduction still outperforms modern games. Today, many games slap on a load of tutorial actions and dialogue to trudge through before any real gameplay can be had. These introductions hold the player's hand in an over-the-top way and make the game's first hour a slog. The saddest part of this is that most games have the same types of movements and control schemes, especially if they live on the same console. Ocarina of Time doesn't hold the player's hand and lets them explore, with most of the button control explanations set as optional dialogue with the Kokiri NPCs and post signs. When looking at Ocarina of Time, we must do so through a contextual lens. The N64 was a beautiful console that brought video games into the 3D world, and Ocarina of Time was the first Zelda game to cross that threshold. Most players only experienced 2D games before this, so you'd think it would feel the need to hold the player's hand through the first section. Instead, Nintendo trusted the players to explore, try things on their own, and fully soak in this brand new experience, one that we take for granted today. This freedom of trial and error is far more fun and rewarding than endless lines of text pop-ups that pause the game repeatedly. But I'm getting ahead of myself, so let's back up a moment and break down Ocarina of Time's introduction in order from start to finish, starting with, well, the start screen. My favorite part of old school gaming was the ability to simply insert a game, turn on the console, and start playing. In the case of Ocarina of Time, the first thing the player experiences when they boot up their N64 is a set of sweeping cinematic shots that follow the hero of time, Link as an adult, and Epona across Hyrule Field. When the player presses start, they realize their journey begins as Child Link. The start screen has already given players something to work toward. Become Adult Link, get the cool horse, and explore the big area they saw before pressing start. The next thing the player is treated to is a brief setup of story. We get some context of who Link is and that he's an outcast. We also see his strange nightmare, which will pay off further into the game. Before the N64, the story for games would be told via text alone, but now Nintendo had another tool in their back pocket: cinematic camera work. They could show and not tell most of the story, which is always better. Off of the dark nightmare Link has, we are introduced to Navi, perhaps Link's most iconic and infamous companion. When the Deku Tree sends her to find Link, the player is treated to a beautiful POV camera that flies around Kokiri Forest and once again shows off the grand scale of this new world. My excitement and sense of wonder were through the roof by the time I took control of Link. I just knew this game was going to be something special. Let's move on to the tutorial aspect of Ocarina of Time. Like I said before, most modern games will bombard you with pop-ups and how to complete every single action. Ocarina of Time only forces the player to engage with the following: find the Great Deku Tree who summoned Link, obtain a sword and shield to proceed to the Great Deku Tree, how to equip Link's sword, shield, and secondary items, how Z-targeting is used to talk or use the shield, and how to listen to Navi. When compared to today, this is pretty minimal information. I mean, come on. Most of the games feel the need to show us how to walk. Do we really need that pop-up? The information given in Ocarina of Time is spread out as you explore Kokiri Forest and not presented in rapid succession. Each control or quest instruction is provided at an appropriate time and doesn't feel out of place or overbearing. The rest of the information is available via the optional dialogue and post signs I mentioned previously. The post signs and NPCs will teach the player a myriad of movement options and sword techniques. If the player completes these optional controls, they are rewarded with rupees. For example, there's a post sign that teaches Link about the thrust attack. If the player performs a thrust attack on the sign and it breaks, a blue rupee will drop for Link to collect. There's also an NPC who teaches Link how to backflip and side hop while Z-targeting. If the player follows the NPC's instructions, Z-targets the rock next to him, and performs a backflip, the player earns more rupees. The same NPC also explains that jump attacks will inflict double damage, information that the player won't learn unless they talk to this NPC. In fact, I didn't talk to this NPC on my first playthrough and had no clue that I should have been jump attacking the whole time. I think more games should explore Ocarina of Time's information distribution system. Give the player the most important, but not self-explanatory information, and keep the rest optional, but with a valuable reward for engaging with the information. This reward system worked out great in Ocarina of Time because Link needed rupees to purchase the Deku Shield, which is an item needed to complete the main quest. Modern games could imitate this with money or EXP because if there's a valuable reward behind it, more players will be willing to fully engage in everything the tutorial has to offer, but have the ability to skip all of the information on a second playthrough. Now let's move on to my favorite dungeon in Ocarina of Time, the Great Deku Tree. For many Zelda fans, myself included, this is the first dungeon they've experienced. One that made them fall in love with not only Ocarina of Time, but many of its successors. Music has always been a big part of Zelda's identity. Koji Kondo, the game's composer, made the players feel as if they were truly in a hollow tree with the Great Deku's theme. The mix of this creative track with the dungeon's aesthetic, the enemy types that reside within its walls, and the puzzle theme make for an overall enthralling experience. It's no wonder that a kid like me who grew up playing in the woods fell in love with Ocarina of Time so quickly. But more than just the ambiance of the first dungeon makes it great. The gameplay itself is nearly flawless and sets the tone for what the player can expect for the rest of the game. The Great Deku Tree's main objective as a dungeon is to teach the player about verticality in the 3D space. It seems almost silly now, but we've been playing 3D games for decades and we understand this basic video game logic. But at the time of the game's release, many players never experienced this type of exploration before. The same is true when Breath of the Wild taught us what to expect in an open world format on the Great Plateau. First, the player learns to go up. Upon entering the dungeon, a sweeping camera shot gives the player a glimpse of its size, and then the shot ends on Link. However, the frame also shows the player a nearby ladder. This is an example of show, don't tell. Everyone understands what a ladder is used for, and so this camera shot gives the player an idea of where to start without Navi or a different pop-up telling Link where to go. Shortly after climbing the ladder, Navi will inform Link that some walls are climbable as well. The player now knows to look out for specific textures to aid them in traversal. To match the dungeon's theme, these textures are vine-like. At this point, the player understands the various ways to go up, but now they need to learn how to travel down. At the Great Deku Tree's entrance, players will notice a giant spiderweb in the middle of the first floor. Navi will even tell the player that they can see a new area underneath if they look closely. When the player steps on the web, it will move slightly, indicating its stretch. Once the player traverses upward, they come across a platform that leads to the middle of the dungeon, lining up with the web on the floor. Just before this discovery, a Deku Scrub tells Link about jumping from high places and how to avoid damage via rolling. The player puts two and two together and takes a leap of faith onto the spiderweb, breaking it and sending Link into a new part of the dungeon. Another form of verticality is the water dive mechanic. There's a room filled with water and a rolling spike trap in the middle. A platform rolls back and forth between the room's entrance and the opposite side, the one that Link needs to reach. The platform slides under the spike trap, however there isn't enough space for Link to slide under unharmed. So Navi tells him to dive underwater and press a switch hidden beneath the surface. Once pressed, the water level will fall, and Link can safely cross via the platform. Not only does this room add to the verticality of the game, but it also teaches players about environmental manipulation and timed platforming, all of which are key mechanics throughout the entire game. As the player approaches the boss room, they encounter the last bit of vertical knowledge. Enemies can drop from the ceiling. Leave it to the Zelda team to find new ways of including childhood nightmare fuel, as if giant skull spiders weren't enough. The dungeon is nice enough to only give the player a few of the smaller enemies with this ability before throwing them headfirst into the childhood trauma of the boss. The fight itself requires the player to use what they learned in battle. Either wait for Goma to drop from the ceiling, or knock her down via the fairy slingshot. Then inflict as much damage as you can before she recovers and climbs the wall again. Zelda bosses have always been large monsters and beasts, but for the first time, the player experienced one in the 3D space. Goma felt larger than life for those players when the game was released. Like many aspects of the Great Deku Tree, this boss set the stage for what players are to expect for the rest of the playthrough. The start of a game and its core gameplay loop's main objective is to set up the player's expectations. The Great Deku Tree completes this objective with precision. Once Link completes the dungeon, he is rewarded with the Kokiri's Emerald and is instructed to gather 2 more spiritual stones, a task he must leave the forest to complete. As the player takes their first steps out of the forest, they are treated by a wide sweeping shot of Hyrule Field, one that most likely had some influence on Breath of the Wild's famous opening shot. A beautiful end to a beautiful start.